All right, let's dive straight into this explainer. We're going to explore a fascinating and honestly a recurring pattern in American history. What actually happens to our constitutional rights when the entire nation mobilizes for war? Today, we're zeroing in on the United States during World War I because this specific era just perfectly illustrates a really profound tension. How does a republic, one that traditionally distrusts permanent military commitments, suddenly flip a switch and mobilize on a massive scale? And maybe even more importantly, how do we reconcile fighting for freedom abroad while simultaneously suspending civil liberties right at home? Well, let's find out. Now look at the dramatic 180-degree pivot Woodrow Wilson makes here in less than a year. It's kind of wild. In 1916, he won his re-election campaign by literally promising peace. "He kept us out of war" was the slogan. But just 1 month after his second inauguration in April 1917, he's standing in front of Congress asking for a formal declaration of war, declaring that, quote, "the world must be made safe for democracy." This rapid transformation perfectly frames the central paradox we're looking at today. How on earth did the nation get from point A to point B so quickly?
Section 1. The reluctant belligerent.
So, for nearly 3 whole years after the war kicked off in August 1914, the U.S. maintained official neutrality. That was the default position, and it actually echoed all the way back to George Washington's farewell address. But geographic distance and American neutrality were ultimately completely overrun by the deadly realities of naval combat. See, Britain had blockaded Germany, and Germany retaliated with unrestricted submarine warfare. In May 1915, a German U-boat sank the British ocean liner the RMS Lusitania. Over 1,000 people died, including 128 Americans. Germany temporarily backed down with what was called the Sussex Pledge, but by February 1917, facing a military stalemate, they essentially said, "forget it," and resumed unrestricted submarine attacks. The pressure was seriously mounting.
And then comes the final, undeniable provocation. It's called the Zimmermann telegram, and it's basically a coded cable from German Foreign Secretary Arthur Zimmermann to the German ambassador in Mexico. It proposed a totally secret alliance. If the U.S. entered the war, Mexico should join Germany to recover its lost territory in Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. I mean, wow, right? British intelligence intercepted and decoded this message. Once they shared it with the U.S., and American newspapers splashed it across their front pages in March 1917, public opinion decisively shifted toward intervention. There was just no going back.
Section 2. The arsenal of democracy.
Okay, so with war declared in April 1917, the nation rapidly shifted gears to mobilize on an absolutely staggering, unprecedented scale. We're not just talking about sending troops, this was a total top-to-bottom reorganization of American society. And the crucial point here is that Wilson framed this not as your typical war for imperial power, but as a deeply idealistic crusade to completely restructure the international order. His 14 points, introduced in 1918, proposed a transformative vision: self-determination of peoples, freedom of the seas, and a League of Nations to peacefully resolve any future disputes. He was actively offering the world an alternative to the very nationalist aims that had started the war in the first place.
To back up those massive ideals, the domestic transformation had to be absolute. The Selective Service Act of 1917 registered nearly 24 million men. 24 million, with nearly 3 million ultimately inducted into military service. But it wasn't just the military, you know. The War Industries Board coordinated industrial production. The Food Administration, led by Herbert Hoover, managed the agriculture side of things. And the Committee on Public Information, they produced a literal industrial-scale propaganda campaign just to generate popular support. The entire nation was put to work.
Section 3. The price of dissent.
Now we have to confront the dark corollary of all this massive public mobilization, and that is the systematic suppression of domestic dissent. Generating popular support apparently meant crushing opposing voices. The Espionage Act of 1917 was incredibly broad, making it a federal crime to obstruct military recruitment or cause insubordination. But then the Sedition Act of 1918 went so much further. It actually criminalized mere words. Uttering or publishing disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language about the government, the Constitution, or the flag became straight-up illegal. And the application of these laws was severe. Over 2,000 Americans were prosecuted. To put that into perspective, prominent Socialist Party leader Eugene V. Debs was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison simply for giving a speech. He argued that workers shouldn't fight what he viewed as a capitalist war, and he got 10 years for it. The targets of these laws were disproportionately people who were already marginal to the mainstream political community: socialists, labor organizers, and immigrants.
Section 4. Clear and present danger.
As you can imagine, this intense crackdown on speech inevitably led to a massive legal showdown at the very highest level of government. The constitutional integrity of the United States was really being put to the test here. Before we reveal how the Supreme Court answered, I want you to ask yourself this fundamental question about the limits of liberty during a national crisis. If the First Amendment guarantees free speech, does that right still fully exist when the nation is quite literally trying to survive a global war?
Well, in 1919, the court delivered a unanimous no to that question in the landmark case Schenck v. United States. Here's what happened. Charles Schenck, a Socialist Party official, had printed and mailed out about 15,000 leaflets to draft-age men. His main argument was that the draft was a form of involuntary servitude, which he said violated the 13th Amendment. Because he urged resistance, he was convicted under the Espionage Act. Writing for the unanimous court, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes used this iconic analogy to argue that context absolutely matters. You've almost certainly heard this phrase before. Holmes argued that in ordinary, peaceful times, Schenck's speech might actually be protected. But wartime recruitment was essentially a crowded theater, and sending out his anti-draft pamphlets was the equivalent of falsely shouting fire and causing a panic.
Which brings us directly to the clear and present danger standard. This specific standard became the very first Supreme Court test for the limits of First Amendment speech protection, fundamentally altering American constitutional law. It established that Congress does have a right to prevent substantive evils, and if speech poses a clear and present danger of bringing about those evils, then it simply is not protected.
Section 5. The First Red Scare.
So even after the armistice was finally signed and the war ended, the machinery of suppression found a brand new target. Wartime anxiety very quickly morphed into a post-war panic. What actually triggered this panic? It was really a perfect storm of events. The 1917 Russian Revolution had politicians terrified of Bolshevik infiltration. Then, in 1919 alone, there were over 3,000 labor strikes, including massive citywide ones in Seattle and Boston. Add to that a very real, terrifying series of mail bombs addressed to prominent business and government figures in the spring of 1919. All of this intensified a nationwide hysteria regarding domestic communism, which we now know as the First Red Scare.
6,000. That staggering number represents the amount of people arrested in just one single month, January 1920, during what became known as the Palmer Raids, led by Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer. Spanning 33 cities, federal agents frequently conducted these raids without arrest warrants. They specifically targeted suspected radicals and immigrants. Approximately 500 foreign nationals were deported, including the very famous anarchist Emma Goldman. National security was actively being invoked to enforce political conformity.
But ultimately, the whole hysteria just collapsed under its own weight. Attorney General Palmer had publicly predicted a massive, violent revolutionary uprising for May 1, 1920. When that day came and went without so much as a whisper of revolution, the government's dire predictions proved entirely false. Furthermore, when the Assistant Secretary of Labor actually sat down and reviewed the deportation cases, he found that most of the detainees had absolutely no connection to any radical organizations whatsoever. It revealed a massive government overreach in the name of security, which heavily discredited the raids.
Section 6. The Historical Pattern. To wrap up this explainer, we need to zoom out for a second and understand why this specific era of history, World War I and its immediate aftermath, is so absolutely critical for us to study today. World War I established a recurring historical pattern. Notice how in moments of perceived national emergency, the nation tends to suppress the very civil liberties that distinguish a democracy from an autocracy. We see it with the Espionage Acts of World War I targeting dissenters, then Japanese-American internment during World War II, McCarthyism in the Cold War, or the massive surveillance expansions post-9/11. National security is repeatedly invoked, and it almost always disproportionately affects minority or marginalized groups.
Which brings us right to the core tension at the heart of the American experiment. How much liberty is a democracy really justified in sacrificing in the name of security? Historical hindsight almost always concludes that during these crises, the sacrifice of rights was far greater than the actual danger ever warranted. So I want to leave you with this final vital question to consider the next time our nation inevitably faces a crisis. Will we just repeat the pattern again, or will we finally find a new balance? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning and keep learning.